My name's Janelle McCoy. I'm the owner-operator for Badass Hoofs, and so we do contract grazing, or I do contract grazing work to restore lands using a friendlier method, one that's more akin to the natural balance of the way the world was before we added fences and things like that. So I also do shearing work. My contract work is mostly in around the southern Willamette Valley outside of Eugene, or sometimes inside Eugene too, but my shearing work takes me all over Oregon. Contract grazing, sometimes it's called strategic grazing, is where we kind of take a regenerative agriculture practice into maybe a private property, a school, a park, a conservation site, and use intensive grazing practices to clear up fuel ladders or invasive species, or maybe an overdensity of even native species. Like Oregon ash can get really thick, or wild roses or native roses can get really thick. And we bring the animals there to browse and graze, as opposed to the organization or person using herbicide or mastication, or mowing essentially, which just treats everything the same, which is not how nature works. Some species work a little bit better when browsed or grazed, almost like pruned. And a lot of the work, it's not even just about them eating, it's also about the way that they will gently till the soil, and without using a deeper mechanical tiller that might both break up the biomass too much and compact the soil, since it's a heavy piece of equipment. These guys are pretty light-footed, and so they're lighter than maybe like if you were using cows. Sometimes I also use alpacas and llamas, which, though they're heavier, they have an even lighter impact because of the structure of their feet. And so we use them to bring a more natural process around to the work, the grazing and browsing that we're doing. So the sheep and the goats work hand in hand, very complementary. Sheep tend to eat a little lower to the ground, whereas goats eat a little higher. And so these particular breeds of sheep, they're primitive breeds for the most part, eat very similarly to goats. Yeah, so I like to call it a midlife correction, not a midlife crisis. Had a very inspired career change. I grew up in a rural area in North Carolina, but we didn't grow up on a farm. But I was around farming, being in a rural area, and it was just, I felt like it was kind of in my genes. Like my grandparents would have grown up on farms. They didn't own the land, but they were farming for somebody else. So it didn't seem that far afoot, honestly. And I just kept on ruminating, pun intended, I guess, about just how much I wanted to be outside and how much I wanted to work with animals. And I explored that a lot and did more research. I knew that if I worked with animals, I didn't want to do a meat production. Not that I'm judging people that do, but I also know how my heart is big and that I get really attached to my animals. So I decided to figure out how to do contract grazing as a way to be, not just a farmer of animals, but really a farmer of the soil, and trying to improve soil health in my own way. And so I did a lot of research into regenerative grazing practices, worked in a natural areas park for several years, and then the two kind of came together. I also went to shearing school so I could understand even more about husbandry and how to work with fiber animals, and so that I could preach that gospel anywhere that I shear as well, and teach other people about how to raise their animals for regenerative purposes. I think motivations for my clients can vary. For example, we're on the spot right now. This property is owned by Tibetan refugees that are Buddhist in their practice, and this very much fits within their cultural practices and their religious beliefs, being able to live in balance with the land. They also have memories from being in a refugee camp surrounded by ruminants, and so I think this brings back, the probably the very few positive parts of that nostalgia, and it's comforting in a way. And I think that they really enjoy living in balance. I think the practical aspect of this particular property and some other private properties that I've been on is that a lot of our neighborhoods in Eugene are heavily sloped, and so it makes it very difficult for a property owner to either hire out or do themselves the kind of maintenance, initial maintenance that sometimes you run up against when you're new to a property. Blackberries are really rough, digging out those crowns, the root crowns, and they're, inevitably probably on a hillside, and very prickly. So if you can introduce a methodology that makes that a little easier, then people are all for it. Another client of mine is a school, and I go and graze there during the summer. It happens to be surrounded by a really dense population. There's an apartment complex on two sides of that property, a playground on the other side, and then a school in front. And so you just have this beautiful synergy of people that are interested in what you're doing. And we've been there several years now, so the grandparents and parents, caregivers really look forward to bringing children or friends to meet the animals. It's like having a petting zoo in your backyard for a month or two, and so that's been really positive. And yeah, so I think it's kind of people, whether it's your religious beliefs or just the social interaction with the animals. These guys are all really docile, very people forward, very friendly animals. Or maybe you're just thinking more just from a practical standpoint, like how else would you do this? What are my options? And if you're not comfortable, or it's not even possible per se to do it a different way, then this is maybe where you land. There's some dormancy that does happen in the winter, but rarely is our weather such that even after we get a few frosts, it's not like everything goes to sleep here. We don't have weeks on end below freezing, so there's still some work that can be done. And in some ways, if the slope is right and they're not standing in water, which is a concern, a good time to do some contract grazing is the winter, especially on a slope, because they can get into the blackberries a little bit better, or the ivy, for example, while it's semi-dormant and before it's establishing new shoots and new runners. So I actually find that it's a really good time to graze. Your sword ferns, which stay green in the winter, it's a good time to prune them. They need some pruning to regenerate for the spring. So if you allow them to overgraze, they'll eat the whole thing, but usually what they do is just prune it. They don't eat sedges really, which are what you might find in a wetland. Sedges are great for absorbing all that winter water, so having them, maybe just slightly, touched to not at all is a positive as well. So every season has its challenges. I think sometimes the spring might be the most challenging in a way, because depending on your location, if you have some native plants you're trying to protect, then spring is not a great time, nor do you want to really disturb nesting birds in an environment like that. So that's a good time to put them on a pasture, as the grasses are waking up. Now I have to be careful about what parasites they might pick up, if the grass is really wet, and be on top of anti-parasitics, deworming. I try not to over deworm, but I really have to think about and watch their eyelids very carefully, watch their health very carefully, and look for clues, as to what they might be picking up. So I do think every season has its nuance, but I wouldn't say that there's like one season where you absolutely cannot graze. You just have to find a different way to do it. When we have exacerbated conditions, whether it's dryness or triple-digit temperatures for long periods, all of this lush brush around us becomes possible wildfire fuel. So it's really important for us to start thinking about preventing catastrophic fires, regardless of how you manage that, whether it is masticating, herbicides, hand digging out a crown root from a blackberry, or you're bringing animals onto your property. There's more and more money through our counties, in that rural-urban interface, in particular to make your property defensible, you know? And so I think that we here in the Valley need to shift that thought a lot, you know, because it will make it more resilient when you have droughts, you know? So inviting native plants, taking care of these fuel ladders, you know, to prevent catastrophic fires, protects you and your neighbors. And it also opens up the forest floor, or just the prairie in general, wherever you are, to grasses that are native, that have a different kind of root system that can handle the dryness, or plants or forbs or whatever that is, so that we all use less water as well, and we can build up more resiliency in our soils, which will sequester more carbon and sequester more water. Every site is different when we go out and to evaluate it for whether it's right for grazing. You know, I have a short list of toxic plants that I know of. Sometimes there's new ones that I just haven't run across. So if I, for example, run up against rhodies or rhododendron or something in that family like azaleas, then I want to make sure that's not in our grazing site and that it's very well protected in case an animal were to get loose and it goes up towards the house. You know, let's identify what those toxic plants are to the animals. Also just, you know, if we can brush cut a path, depending on how we set up our perimeter, whether that's with electric or sometimes it's with panel fences, you know, what preparation do we need to even bring whatever that fencing solution is going to be? If the landowner can do it, that's just great. It's a lot less labor for me. I also am always looking for my entrance and exit. How do I load them in? How do I load them out? So I want to establish a place where, and be in agreement with a landowner, if I have to drive over a certain patch of grass, is that okay? Do we need to add gravel? What time of year am I driving on that grass? Am I going to rip it up? Because I don't want to do that. I'm here to make the grass better, not worse, you know, or make the vegetation better. I don't want to get stuck either. So, so that's something that is that always has to be considered. Also, where is the water coming from? You know, am I trucking that in, or do they have a supply that we can get to a little bit more easily? I can do either, but these are just big factors to know. Is there, if I have to supplementally feed them as they're kind of drawing down on a site, then am I bringing in vegetation or like hay or something like that that might contaminate the soil in their minds? You know, if I'm bringing in straw for bedding and that sets up and suddenly they have a field of oats, you know, that might not be desirable. So there's things to think about there. Electricity, if I am doing electric, then where is my point of electric? Or do I need to bring in solar or solar battery with panels? Or can I run it off electric? So I think those things are really important to consider. Also, just the infrastructure of what you're setting up. So if you're setting up posts to go along with it, am I putting those posts in a place that's not desirable with the homeowner? I like to have 24/7 access to a site, and so I really need the owner to be okay with that, just in case there's an emergency, or what if a fire did rush in and I needed to help get animals out. I try not to abuse the privilege, but I do need owners to understand that animals might need me outside of banker's hours. I'm very hands-on when I send my animals out. It depends on the site and how secure it is, whether I have experienced or seen any kind of predation. So I like to visit a site. I'm definitely visiting at least once a day. I don't feel comfortable skipping a day. Sometimes it's twice or 3 times a day. It depends on how far away it is. Thus far, I've only done sites that make it possible for me to go twice a day comfortably. Gas is pretty expensive, so that's always a factor. You know, how far am I traveling? Where am I going? What's my shearing schedule, for example, you know, if I can't come twice because I'm shearing down in Medford or something like that. But I really like to be very hands-on. So if something happens, maybe there was a plant that we didn't know about and an animal is sick, I can address it as quickly as possible. Or the fencing breaks down. You know, that's important for me to know and to be testing it and watching it consistently and constantly. So whenever we're doing that initial site prep, if, sometimes you can't cut out, a particular tree or something like that, when you're setting up your kind of parcel for grazing, there might be a madrone in there or something that's relatively young and would be susceptible to a goat ripping off its bark or something like that. So, you'd want to identify those plants or trees, shrubs with a landowner. Set some posts around it, make sure that it's protected. Sometimes that requires, depending on what animals you have on, you might need some, very small grid pattern woven wire to ensure that it's fully protected. Sometimes it just takes some plastic webbing. It would depend on the age of the plant, how vulnerable it is, the vegetation, how vulnerable it is, which animals, how big are they. If I bring a llama over, they're going to be able to reach a lot higher than a lamb. So there's all that to consider as well. You might have to build, a pretty tall cage. Something I do see, which I do think is a benefit on more mature trees, for example, is that, and again, thinking of defensible space and fuel ladders, is that goats will stand on, in the llama, the alpaca, but goats stand on their hind legs to reach lower limbs and kind of take off that vegetation. So it's a great way to limb up your trees if they're, going down to the ground, because their lower limbs are so heavy. That's going to just make them more susceptible to fire. So another benefit of having, the goats, for example, or taller animals is being able to limb up that vegetation. I have a few different ways to protect livestock from predators. I have on my own property, because we are susceptible to coyotes over there, I have 2 llamas and 2 Great Pyrenees. It's better if you can, when I'm out contract grazing, if you can pen them at night. That's always preferred if that's possible. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you don't need to, or it's not possible, or your group is too big. So I think having your Great Pyrenees or another livestock dog is a big help. Having a llama or 2 that is very bonded to your group is also helpful too. It helps protect them against people. Because sometimes it's people that will invade a site, whether they mean to or not, and let your animals out, which causes them to run down 18th Avenue, which happened one time. That was a fun police call. But yeah, so I think that every predator preys in a different way, and just talking to the neighbors to, sometimes they'll say, well, we don't have any predators here. And it's not until you add a group of animals that you realize, there's predators everywhere, honestly, and we're on their land, honestly. So how do you outsmart them? How do you mitigate your risks? Your coyotes will go under, your cougars and bobcats will go over, and you just do the best you can. You're never, rarely are you 100%. I mean, you're never going to be 100% foolproof, but you try to just mitigate those risks where you can. Potential partners thus far that I've been really grateful for is the NRCS, which is a department of the USDA. So I'm really grateful that they're finding funding for some of the projects that I'm working on. And I've found great friends within the watershed councils. For example, locally, our watershed councils are Longtom Watershed. Mackenzie River Trust, for example, is hosting us at a site alongside Longtom Watershed. We have Coast Fork Watershed Council, Mackenzie River Watershed Council. That whole Upper Willamette Stewardship Network, watershed councils, trusts, land trusts, has been really eager to explore this work. So I am grateful for those relationships and their willingness to be curious with me and support my work.